Over the past 5 years, Canadians have woken up almost daily to news reports about the troubled state of Canada's national shipbuilding strategy. Launched in 2011, the strategy to renew Canada's decaying naval and Coast Guard fleets has now gone on for longer than the Second World War. But in stark contrast to World War II, when Canada built over 1,000 ships, not a single ship has been delivered. And with costs spiraling out of control, Canadians are demanding answers. How did it get so bad, and what can be done to fix it? Let's start on the West Coast in Vancouver, where things have got off to a particularly bad start. The first two projects are for two classes of small vessels for the Canadian Coast Guard. Aside from the spiraling costs and multi-year delays, the shipyard has encountered major quality problems. And it was problems with one of the most basic of all skills in shipbuilding, welding. The budget for the offshore oceanographic science vessel for the Coast Guard, which hasn't even begun construction, has already soared by almost 6 times. And that hasn't left any hope for the program to replace Canada's existing 51-year-old polar icebreaker, a far bigger vessel which was meant to be delivered in 2017, but under the current framework, won't be ready for another decade. Then there are the long-delayed joint support ships. They're based on a now obsolete 26-year-old German design which doesn't even conform to latest NATO standards. Their cost is now estimated to be 4 times as much as what the Germans paid to build an identical ship. And DND has readjusted the schedule every single year. Originally meant to be delivered in 2017, then it was 2019, then 2021, and now it is, I quote, 2023 with risk. Translated, that means 2025 at the earliest. Over on the East Coast in Halifax, the situation is no better. The first project, the Arctic offshore patrol ships, are currently 4 years late. They are estimated to cost multiples of what other countries have paid to build similar ships. And as far as the flagship Canadian Surface Combatant project is concerned, well, taxpayers look away now. At $4 billion each, they will be more than twice the cost that the UK government is paying for exactly the same design. Delays in the shipbuilding program are only half of the problem. In 2016, a report tabled by the Minister of Transportation, Mr. Garneau, explained that Navy and Coast Guard ships were having to be taken out of service due to old age much faster than they could be replaced with the current shipbuilding program. It emphasized that changes need to be made to accelerate the renewal of the fleet. While most countries decommission or scrap their ships at between 20 to 30 years old, the poor performance of the current shipbuilding program has left the Canadian Coast Guard fleet with an average age of 36 years. That means a staggering 96% of the fleet is over 30 years old and will absolutely need replacing over the next 5 years. And with ships taking between 3 to 5 years to build, Canada needs to address the issue now. The question that everyone is asking is, how did it get so bad? To answer that, we have to go back 7 years. In 2010, Canada's largest shipyard, which single-handedly constitutes over 50% of Canada's shipbuilding capacity, had run out of work and was in bankruptcy. At the same time, following a government lobbying campaign by the remaining smaller shipyards, which involved over 800 entries being made in the lobbyist register, a strategy was rushed through government to fast-track a competition for the construction of a vast number of ships. But it was a competition of a type never before seen. With Davy out of business, there was no shipyard which could actually take on the work. So instead of evaluating shipyards based on industry-standard criteria like price, schedule, experience, infrastructure, labor availability, and so on, instead it had to be based primarily on just promises of future capability. In essence, that meant shipyards which had no previous experience in building the kind of vessels which were required could win. And that is basically what happened. In fact, you didn't even need to be a shipyard. Despite Davy's request to extend the deadline, in 2011, 2 non-binding agreements were signed with 2 separate shipyards which would allow them to negotiate to build a set number and type of ships for the Navy and Coast Guard. Halifax Shipyard would be able to negotiate the construction of up to 5 Arctic patrol ships and up to 15 surface combatants for the Navy. And Vancouver Shipyard, so long as it could develop a new capability to build large ships without any cost to the taxpayer, would be able to negotiate to build 4 small vessels and a large polar icebreaker for the Coast Guard, as well as 2 supply ships for the Navy. But 1 year later, in 2012, Davy was restarted. And while the 2 other shipyards were still trying to figure out how to build a new shipyard, Davy, with its 190 years of experience, began delivering a wide variety of projects, exporting complex ships for the oil and gas market, refitting Canada's icebreakers, and even putting into service the largest naval vessel ever delivered from a Canadian shipyard. It even won the prize for North American Shipyard of the Year, the first time a Canadian shipyard had been awarded the prestigious title. In the same time period, neither Halifax nor Vancouver was able to deliver a single ship under the new strategy. Instead, each project had spiraled out of control. And one of the key promises made during the original competition, that the costs to upgrade and prepare the shipyards would come at 0 cost to the taxpayer, was quickly forgotten. Yep, federal and provincial taxpayers ended up with bills of hundreds of millions of dollars. But with all that money spent, the question remains, why have they failed to deliver a single ship in 7 years? 2 words: capacity and experience. A shipbuilding strategy which excluded 50% of Canada's shipbuilding capacity was always bound to fail. And although it is possible to build a shipyard in a relatively short amount of time, the skills which are required to build ships take decades to develop. When the Parliamentary Budget Office realized that it took 4 of the world's best German shipyards working together for 5 years to build the same design, it didn't take them long to realize that trying to build the joint support ship in a shipyard whose construction experience was effectively limited to tugboats is near impossible. A bit like trying to build a car in a bicycle shop. You might get there eventually, but it's going to be a long and expensive road. And it has been. So after 7 years, no ships, and billions of dollars spent, Prime Minister Trudeau, who inherited the strategy from the previous government, said enough is enough and instructed government officials to find a solution. So in 2017, they toured the country and visited experts, shipyards, suppliers, and anyone else who could give some ideas as to what to do. There were 2 main questions to answer. Firstly, how to rescue the existing projects in the National Shipbuilding Strategy without starting it all over again. And secondly, with the 2 shipyards already overburdened, how can Canada build all the other ships which need to get built? Specifically, the 22 large ships for the Coast Guard which weren't included in the National Shipbuilding Strategy, but which will need to be built very quickly now. There are 2 things that everyone can agree on. Firstly, to restart the whole national shipbuilding strategy is just going to cause even more delays. And secondly, you can't grant more contracts to already overburdened suppliers who aren't delivering on their existing commitments. That is, as the old adage goes, throwing good money after bad. So the answer is simple and logical: a refresh of the strategy. And there are some time-critical priorities. After the government's own reports highlighted an urgent need for new icebreakers, the first thing the refresh will need to include is a project to build a new fleet of icebreakers which could replace several classes of existing vessels which have reached the end of their lives. And it goes without saying that with the current delays, a second Resolve-class naval supply ship which can be built in under 2 years is an absolute must. The Obelix will guarantee that the Royal Canadian Navy is able to operate on both coasts. If and when the joint support ships are eventually built, the 2 Resolve-class naval support ships will provide the Navy with the capacity it needs to both operate task groups on both coasts while simultaneously providing redundancy for maintenance, international exercises, and missions abroad. Then there's the opportunity to increase the shipbuilding capacity for the existing programs which have fallen behind schedule, in particular the JSS, Polar Icebreaker, and Canadian Surface Combatant. That can easily be achieved using what is known as distributed block assembly method, something that has been adopted for most major international naval shipbuilding programs. It simply means building different sections of a ship at different shipyards for assembly at a different location. It results in the faster delivery of ships, which means a lower cost. It also means spreading industrial benefits throughout the country. It is truly a win-win. Although ship repair and maintenance was specifically excluded from the National Shipbuilding Strategy, with the current shipbuilding programs heavily delayed, the refresh will also need to include a plan of action to look at how the life of the existing fleet can be extended to ensure a sufficient number of vessels can remain in service. Common sense would dictate that other Canadian shipyards, other than the two overburdened shipyards, would take on this vital work, while Halifax and Vancouver focus on catching up with the existing commitments they have fallen behind on. In a nutshell, put politics aside and introduce extra shipbuilding capacity to lighten the load, deliver ships, and spread economic benefits throughout the country. Now is the time for action.